Good afternoon, everyone. I am Luana Lamberti, and I'm a PhD candidate from Ohio State University in Hispanic linguistics. My research focuses on Afro varieties of Spanish spoken in Cuba and of Portuguese spoken in Bahia, Brazil. This talk is part of the Abra Linha ao Vivo event, Linguists Online, that is organized by by Abralin, the Brazilian Linguistics Association, in cooperation with several international associations, such as the Permanent International Linguistics Committee, the Latin America Linguistics and Philology Association, the Argentinian Society of Linguistic Studies, the Linguistic Society of America, the Societas Linguística Europaea, and the Linguistics Association of Great Britain. Please remember that it is important to be an Abralin associate to support linguistics in Brazil. So today I'm here to introduce Dr. Rob Drummond, who is a linguist based in Manchester, UK, involved primarily in social linguistic variation, especially at the level of the sound, urban adolescent speech, dialects, linguistic ethnography, and identity. He's a reader in the Department of Languages at Manchester Metropolitan University, where he supervises PhD students and teaches social linguistics and phonetics to final year undergraduates and MA students. He's also the head of the youth language at the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies. In 2010, he was awarded a PhD in linguistics from the University of Manchester. His thesis is a social phonetic study into variation in L2 phonological acquisition entitled Social Linguistic Variation in a Second Language, the Influence of Local Accent on the Pronunciation of Non-Native English Speakers Living in Manchester. In 2014, he was awarded the Leverhulme Trust Project grant for a project entitled Expressing Inner City Youth Identity Through Multicultural Urban British English. This is a continuation of the work he started in 2013, looking at the speech of 14, 16 years olds in two non-mainstream learning centers in Manchester. In 2019, he was awarded an AHRRC grant to continue his work on Manchester Voices, a series of studies exploring the accents, dialects, and identities of people in Greater Manchester. He also set up the ongoing Accentism Project, in which he explores and shares stories of language-based discrimination, prejudice, and stereotyping. He undertakes and supervises research in social linguistics with a special focus on the following areas: language variation and change, particularly for phonetic and phonological variation, urban youth language, social linguistics and grime music, dialect acquisition, social linguistic variation in a second language, language and identity, the acquisition of linguistic variation, and social linguistics and language teaching. Now, Dr. Drummond will give the talk entitled Researching Urban Youth Language and Identity. Thank you so much, Dr. Drummond.
Right, thank you very much. Thanks ever so much for that welcome. And thanks for inviting me in the first place. It's a great thing you've got going here. And I think this resource is going to be fantastic, as long as for however long these videos stay up there. I mean, I've already learnt a lot from the ones I've seen, and I'm delighted to be part of it. So I'm going to use some slides. So I'll just try and share the screen. Let's go for that one. And I'm hoping you've got there an introductory slide, a title slide, okay? I presume someone's, yeah, excellent, right. So the reason I'm just going to leave that title up there for a second is that it's the study I'm going to be talking about, the research I'm going to be talking about is as much about the process of doing the research as it is about the results. So, I've called it Researching Urban Youth Language and Identity because it really is about that process of researching, of doing the actual, of doing the work itself. Because this wasn't a straightforward project, and it's a project I'm really proud of, and I think I've learned a lot from it, and I think I've found some interesting things, but I think it was doing it. It was the process of doing it in which I learned the most. So a little bit about me, because unlike many of the speakers you've had already, you won't know who I am. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown. So there was quite a lot of detail in that introduction. Thank you very much. But yeah, so I work within sociolinguistics, particularly at the level of sound. And I've got kind of 3 big projects on the go, at the same time. Each one sort of comes and goes depending on what's needed. But the big project on youth language, which is what I'm going to talk about today. But I also have a really nice project on the go with my colleague, Dr. Erin Carey at Manchester Met. So we run this project together, and we have 2 additional people working on it, Dr. Segi Ryan and Dr. Holly Dan. And that's called Manchester Voices, and that's looking at the regional accents, dialects, identities, attitudes, and perceptions of people living in an area of the UK known as Greater Manchester. Then we have, as was mentioned earlier on, we have this language prejudice project called the Accentism Project. Again, this is with my colleague, Dr. Erin Carey. And here we're looking at all sorts of, anything to do with language prejudice, discrimination, or even just negative stereotyping, anything to do with kind of that area of language. And there's a site, which I'll mention very, very briefly at the end, but accentism.org, which is just at the moment, it's a repository of stories of people, a place where people can share stories of language-based discrimination. And there's also lots of resources of academic articles to do with the subject, but also mainstream articles in newspapers and online blogs and whatever. So that's quite a nice thing. Before I was interested in sociolinguistics, I was, before this part of sociolinguistics, I was looking at language variation in the second language. This was sparked from my PhD, which looked at the kind of, let's say, accent variation, dialect acquisition in a second language, and was really looking at the speech of Polish people living in Manchester. Because I learned from my experience, the previous experience at the bottom there as a TESOL educator, as a language teacher, I noticed that a lot of my students, when I was teaching in Manchester, some of my students from other countries who were learning English, some of them seemed to acquire a Manchester accent and some of them didn't. And I thought that was interesting. And that's what led me to start looking at sociolinguistic variation, even though I didn't know what it was at the time. And the reason I'm telling you all this, there is a point to all this, is that this background very much influenced the research that I do and the topic which I'm going to talk about today. And it's also to reassure people. I know lots of people, hopefully watching this at some point, there'll be some very experienced people who know all this and have been through lots of research themselves. And there'll be people starting out. And I know also there'll be some people who aren't quite at university yet, but want to study linguistics. And it's just to reassure those people that I honestly fell into this without really knowing what sociolinguistics was. And so I think the point is, we never know everything. We never, you always feel there's so much to learn, and that's usually a good thing. So you can see it in 2 ways. You can see it as there's so much to explore, and I don't know anything yet, and how exciting that is to then go and learn all this stuff. Or it can be a bit daunting because everybody seems to know more than you. This feeling never goes away, I have to tell you, as far as I know. But it's not a problem. It should be seen as a positive thing. There's loads to learn. You don't know everything. You will. Some things you'll learn, you look back on and think, I wish I'd known that earlier on, or it was, how did I possibly not know that earlier on? But you have to learn somewhere. So anyway, this is my particular academic journey from being an EFL teacher to what I'm doing now. Okay. So youth language. So I'm going to talk about youth language. Now, youth language, of course, itself is a bit of a strange term because, what are we talking about? There can't possibly be one type of youth language. Young people are different all around the world. If you're looking at, the language of young people in London is going to be very different to the language of young people in, Sydney or in Ghana or in Vietnam or wherever. Young people's experiences and young people's and how those experiences are related to language are going to be very, very different. Even within the same country, if I think about the United Kingdom, young people in London compared to young people in Newcastle, in Leeds, in Edinburgh, in Belfast. They're all going to have different experiences. And then when you start thinking about different, the effects of social class, socioeconomic status, of gender, of ethnicity, of sexuality, of all of these things, it's going to make young people's experiences very different. So how can we possibly think of youth language in that sense? So, and we could also take a sort of a language perspective and think, well, youth language is any language in which people are somehow enacting a youth identity. But then that maybe becomes slightly problematic in that by that way of thinking, literally, you know, you could have a 35-year-old or a 55-year-old enacting a youth identity in some way, and is that the language that's worthy of looking at? So, well, not worthy, but of interest. So there's all sorts of the point is, I'm very aware that the term youth language is potentially huge and a little bit vague. So what I'm looking at when I started out on this kind of research was looking at the language of young people, you know, chronologically aged young people, say between, you know, I had in my mind at the time, maybe sort of 13 or 14 to 19, 20, something like that. So that kind of age. And then I'm particularly interested in when language is used to enact particular youth identities in some way. And I'll come back to that approach to identity as we go on. So why young people anyway? What's the interest in looking at the language of young people? Obviously, it's a really fascinating time of life. It's interesting in terms of well, it's interesting from a linguistic point of view in that young people are at the forefront of language change. You know, we know that language changes over time, but we also know that language stays relatively fixed within a lifespan, relatively. You know, there are changes, which means that the changes that happen in language are happening between generations. And so we just know that we just have to listen to we always give examples of, well, English is not the same as it was in whatever, Shakespeare's day, in Chaucer's day. But you can look at it much closer than that. You're very aware that as young people, they don't speak language, they don't speak English in the same way as maybe their grandparents did or people of their grandparents' age. And sure enough, as these people maybe have children and the generations below them, they'll speak differently from them too. So we know this. So adolescence is an exciting time from a language point of view. It's also a very interesting time from an identity point of view, because of course, this is the period of life when people are finding their way in the world and working out who they are and experimenting with music, with fashion, with piercings, tattoos, whatever behavior. And part of their kind of experimentation is through language, maybe testing the boundaries of what's acceptable, maybe, you know, wanting to associate with certain groups and disassociate from others. So of course, all of that comes through language. So that's an interesting time of life. The other reason I wanted to look at youth language was because of work that's previously been done in London in what's called Multicultural London English, or MLE, by people like Jenny Cheshire and Paul Kurzweil and Sue Fox and even Torgerson. And I've put the reference there at the bottom of one of the main outputs from these studies. I was very interested in the way in this was you can look up for yourself what it is, and they're really great projects, but it's looking at this new sort of repertoire, or this emerging repertoire, a different way of speaking in London that was being influenced by all the different languages and cultures that were existing in London, at the time and still do, and they were all having an influence on this new way of speaking. And I was interested in that because I could hear the same kind of things happening in Manchester, where I sort of work and live. So I was interested in what was going on there. I was also interested in looking at youth language because of the way in which youth language is perceived by people outside. So if we think about the MLE is an academic investigation, an academic labeling of a type of language that particularly young people are using. But this was often portrayed in the mainstream media and other places as in very negative ways. So this title of kind of ghetto grammar and Jafaican, which is an annoyingly kind of clever little pun, but completely factually incorrect. You know, so these terms are sort of, you know, linguistically inaccurate, but socially pervasive. They appeared in lots of places. So the point is, the language of young people was viewed negatively. There was lots of prejudice about it. Actually, there's an example from one sort of commentator at the time. He's disappeared a little bit. His name is Lindsay Johns, and he used to pop up on, you know, on sort of radio and write columns in newspapers and whatever. And he said about young people's use of English, particularly in London, he said, "We don't live in Timbuktu or the South Bronx. We live in England, so speak proper English. The sad truth is that street slang makes the people who use it sound as if they've had an exceedingly painful frontal lobotomy. With the innits, basicallys, and you get me bloods, they sound like morons. Slang makes people sound uneducated and stupid." You don't have to be a sociolinguist to see that this kind of, or a discourse analyst to see that this kind of commentary, this kind of description of language is damaging and incorrect. You know, there's a sophistication to it, as hopefully I'll show, that is completely missed by these really sort of obtuse, inaccurate observations. So I was interested in it being an interesting period of life, in MLE, in the way it's perceived outside. And also I was interested in seeing if, like I said, if a similar thing was happening in London as was happening in London, if it was happening in Manchester. So a similar thing to MLE, to Multicultural London English. So maybe this would be seen as something like Multicultural Manchester English, but I have a feeling there's more to it than that. And I wonder if there are similarities in cities across the UK where people are speaking, young people especially, are speaking in MLE type ways, yet they still retain their local pronunciation. And this is what I was hearing in Manchester. So, which is, you know, why I did it. But I still think there's a lot more to be done in other places in the country. So I named this idea multicultural urban British English at the time, with this idea that it was a kind of an overarching variety of English where each place has its own version of it. So it's sort of MLE, but regionally specific. So it's an overarching one. So I came up with this multicultural urban British English. I've just written a chapter for something on it, and I'm backing away a little bit from the urban part of the label. I'm sort of realizing this certainly has particular negative connotations and stereotypical and inaccurate connotations in US English, and it does to a lesser extent, it also does so in UK English. And also, it's looking like young people are using this way of speaking. I was using the label urban to thinking geographically, specifically urban in the city, but young people appear to be using this way of speaking outside the cities. So anyway, I'm tentatively dropping the urban label. So I'm thinking multicultural British English. So that was the thinking behind doing the research in the first place. So the actual project I'm going to talk about, as just mentioned in the introduction, was labeled Expressing Inner City Youth Identity Through Multicultural Urban British English. There's a website there if people are interested. I'll put it again at the end. Now, the research, in starting the research, I wanted to access young people, and I was interested in, you know, with this, so you think kind of schools, but there's another group of young people who are particularly interesting, and these were the young people who were not being educated in mainstream schools, but were being educated in what are called, in the UK, pupil referral units. Now, a pupil referral unit caters for young people who have been excluded from mainstream school for whatever reason, usually for behavioral reasons. The numbers, so in 2017-18, 0.2% of secondary pupils were permanently excluded. So it's a small number, but it's still, a significant number. Out of those people, it's boys, more likely. Boys are 3 to 4 times more likely than girls to be permanently excluded. People from lower socioeconomic status are more likely to be excluded, up to 4 times more likely. And the most common reason for being excluded is what's known as persistent disruptive behavior. So it's a fascinating area to work in, and also an area which is often ignored or often just not known about. Sure, there's lots of people in the UK that don't really think about what happens to the young people who do get excluded from mainstream school. Where do they actually go? Well, this is where they go, and they're put together and they're educated. They follow the same national curriculum, just a restricted curriculum. And it's a like I say, it's a fascinating part of education, and one that deserves a bit more attention, in my opinion. So I went through a lot of this, as just kind of stroll into these places, through a lot of preliminary work and sort of smaller pilot studies and building of relationship with the pupil referral unit in Manchester. I ended up doing the research in 2 learning centres. Now, the learning centres are very different to schools. They're very small. They're much more of a sort of a youth club type atmosphere. There are classrooms, but they're not the buildings themselves aren't necessarily purpose built. Certainly these ones weren't. These were ex-youth clubs, and they're small. So they only have about between 10 and 12 people in each learning centre. And I'm looking at 2 school years, the school years of 10 and 11, in year 10 and year 11 in the UK system, which means their age between 14 and 16. And at any one time, a learning centre would have 6 young people from year 10 and 6 from year 11. So we had a kind of a maximum of 12 people in any one centre. In theory, when you think about this type of research, you might think, community of practice. If you're thinking of looking at language variation, you're looking at, I was thinking taking a more ethnographic approach to this research, which I'll talk about in a minute. You think maybe communities of practice might be a good way of viewing the people, of approaching the situation. I don't think, and a lot of community of practice studies are based in schools, or a lot of school-based studies use a communities of practice type approach. I don't think it's relevant here, mainly because of the size. So in any school-based ethnography, when you're using communities of practice, you're looking at how different groups, share particular social practices and group together, or they may go to different places, they may hang out in different places, they're oriented to different things, they have different hobbies, they may be pro-school or anti-school, and all of these things. This simply wasn't possible in such a study. It's so small, so people are forced to be there. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't take a communities of practice approach, but they were forced there, and they were very small, like physically small as well. So there simply wasn't the space for different groups to align in different ways. Which made it, another reason why it was so fascinating is you've got very different people kind of forced into the same situation, and people who maybe wouldn't normally speak to each other at all in a bigger school. They might be completely different social groups, but here they had to work together. And of course, the whole pro-school, anti-school thing is a bit of a non-starter, because almost by definition, the fact that they're there means that they're largely going to be anti-school in that traditional sense. So this was the context. Now, the people, right? The reason this is important is because this attempted collaboration between 2 researchers is what led to the whole interesting debate around the process of carrying out the project. So there were 2 people involved. So I was involved, and a colleague, Susan Dray. Now, a little bit of a background is, so that's the reason I gave you the background at the beginning. You can see where I come from in terms of sociolinguistics, but I would say I come from quite a traditional variationist sociolinguistic background. So, you know, and if we think of, so just in case people don't know, variation is sociolinguistics. There's a nice description from Tagliamonte: the study of the interplay between variation, social meaning, and the evolution and development of the linguistic system itself. And that's kind of, you know, what I was interested in. It often takes a very quantitative approach to the analysis of language features, and it traditionally, in what are now seen as the first, and certainly the first wave, and also the second wave, would be, you know, looking at these, taking this quantitative analysis and seeing how they relate to quite macro categories, social categories of such as like age and gender, and then later engagement in social networks, and so on. And so I think like I tried to explain at the beginning, I fell into sociolinguistics a bit, coming from an English language teaching background. All it was, I just had this interesting idea, I'd had this interesting observation, and you know, about my students acquiring or not acquiring a particular accent in their second language. And I thought, you know, I had the opportunities to study, and this seemed like an interesting subject. And it was only gradually I realized, actually, this is sociolinguistics. It's not a very well-defined area of sociolinguistics, to be fair. That mixture of sociolinguistics and second dialect acquisition within a second language is you know, there's a few people working in it, but it's a fascinating area. Anyway, so I kind of fell into it there, and I fell into it, I guess, with sort of first, second wave, quite traditional, traditional approach. But because I was interested in the numbers, I was interested in statistics, I still am, and I'm interested in the way that you can use these numbers, the statistical analysis, to uncover these patterns. And I still think that's a hugely fascinating area of language. And I always felt there was some kind of objective truth to this that was maybe lacking in different areas of linguistics. Now, I don't think that way now, but I think that's quite a common feeling, that there is some kind of, you know, some kind of objective truth. But the problem with all of this, and the reason there's a but there, is that I wasn't completely at ease with some of the methods of traditional variationist sociolinguistics, particularly around data collection. So I was a little bit troubled, you know, after my PhD and after doing my research. Like I say, my PhD was quite traditional, carried out using very strict kind of sociolinguistic interviews, and so no problem with that at all. It's only gradually, as I carried on doing different work, I started to reflect on that and think something not quite right about that idea of just interviewing somebody, taking that recording, taking that data, and then doing all our fancy statistical work with it, or all our vowel measurements, whatever, and then presenting it, you know, in whatever, at a conference or in an article or something, analyzing it and you know, presenting these findings or theories or whatever, helping to support theories. And in that process, the actual context of how that data was captured, of how that recording was made, becomes lost. So we start to completely, however much we think sociolinguistics is about real language, the language of you know, of everyday speech, you know, which is a huge strength of the subject, we're still guilty of almost abstracting away that very context in which we gathered the data. And part of this is the problem with the idea of a sociolinguistic interview, where you meet somebody, you have a great conversation. It's very, you know, ideally it's very relaxed, and you're getting people to speak in their most natural. I have a bit of a problem with that idea now, but then you have this recording, and then you go away and do your analysis. But of course, how that person speaks to you in that recording very much depends on how they relate to you, and to you as the interviewer, who's interviewing them. You know, in lots of these big studies that, you know, some of which are very, very famous, and, you know, they're the sort of foundations of what we do in our discipline, sometimes the interviews are being carried out by different people, but that's forgotten, which seems odd considering when we're all back in our sociolinguistics classroom, you know, teaching our new students about how language varies, which we're looking at, you know, one of the absolute basics is that we know that we speak differently depending on who we're speaking to. So on the one hand, we're teaching that. And on the other hand, we're saying, look at this study where we've kind of forgotten who actually interviewed who, but look at all this data. I think, I don't know if I've explained that very well, but that was my issue. And of course, I'm not the first person to have a problem with or to question sociolinguistic interviews. John Rickford has a fascinating analogy of a sociolinguistic interview being like a fisherman's net cast into a river, with what is caught possibly being useful and even valuable, but not an accurate or complete sample of what lies beneath. And I think that kind of perfectly sums up my issue with it. I'm not at all saying it's not useful, but I think we have to sometimes remind ourselves of the context and remind our audience of the context within which the data was gathered in the first place. So with all of these concerns, I ended up finding my sort of maybe more natural place within third wave variationist sociolinguistics, which, which you'd have to, which you'll either know about or you'll be finding out about, but very much the idea that language use constructs rather than reflects identities, and we start relying less on these kind of macro social categories and so on. And I was also becoming more interested in interactional sociolinguistics, so looking at how language actually changes, shifts within individual interactions, which meant, of course, I was getting more interested in an ethnographic approach, which is where Susan comes in. So I have this project ready to go, and I knew my skill set of a sort of traditional variationist, and I was but with a problematic relationship with this discipline. So I wanted a real interactional person, a discourse analyst, and an ethnographer, and Susan Dray was perfect with this. So she was very interested in how language is used crucially alongside other resources. So alongside, language is just one part of what we look at, and she was a real proper kind of linguistic ethnographer. And this is where I started to learn a lot, and this is where we started to have our problems, because the two approaches don't necessarily go together particularly well. So what we were trying to do was to combine variationist, approaches, sort of traditional variationist approaches with more ethnographic and interactional approaches to language in a pupil referral unit, which you can imagine was quite a lively sort of place. Now, this combining of approaches is nothing new, and we weren't ever claiming it to be new. Other people have tried to combine approaches. Some of those examples that I've given there, Julia Snell, Devyani Sharma, and Rob Perezva, some of those may be looking at ways, using ethnography as a way to access different language that they wouldn't normally have got access to through traditional sociolinguistic interview type things. Or other people have combined approaches such as Penny Eckert, Sam Kirkham, Emma Moore. Maybe these could be seen more as using ethnography in order to find alternative categories rather than those big macro categories. And they might not agree, the people here might not agree with that interpretation actually, but this is certainly how Susan, as an ethnographer, saw what was happening in these studies, and she would see it very much as a variationist enterprise. However ethnography was being used, it was still a variationist enterprise, and the ethnographic, how she described it, the thick descriptions are always mentioned, always discussed, but only to support the language data. So it's still we're looking at language variation as the absolute kind of most important thing, and then we have the ethnography to back it up, which is fine. That's a useful approach to take. So we were trying to do this. I've realized the beauty of doing a presentation like this is you can just later, if you're interested, you could just pause this and get the references like that. Anyway, so those were the studies. Sorry, those were the studies I've just been talking about. So although this type of collaboration in terms of the, combining approaches was nothing new, actual collaboration is much rarer, I think. Actual collaboration between one person from one discipline and one approach and another person from another approach, that is much less common. So you can combine approaches like those studies have done before, but they were still the same people, were just looking at different ways of doing things. But if you have people from two different disciplines and try and collaborate, things get a bit more difficult. And it happens, and there's a lovely study, Devyani Sharma and Ben Rampton, they show a really nice kind of combination of the two. And of course, and they're from, you could say they're from sort of different disciplines in a sort of similar way to, I'm not for a minute comparing myself to either Devyani Sharma or Ben Rampton, I have to say, but we're from the two people are from sort of different backgrounds in a similar way to me and Susan. However, that collaboration happened after the data had been collected. So if I recall correctly, this was data that Devyani Sharma had, and then reanalyzed it using a different approach with the help of Ben Rampton. So of course, that kind of collaboration is quite straightforward, but collaboration in trying to collect the data in the first place is much more difficult, because research always involves compromise one way or another. We know that if anybody collecting natural language, anybody collecting spoken language, probably any language, actually, yeah, if you're collecting language in use in some way in your research, of course you have to make compromises. It's just the nature of what we do. And it's much easier to compromise with yourself. So when you're approaching a situation, and you're approaching a context and you're trying to gather data in two different ways, it's very easy if you're just by yourself or with another person who thinks the same as you to just say, okay, well, we can't quite do it that way, so we'll just do it this way for now. But if you've got another person who genuinely approaches something in a completely different way, somehow you have to work out what you're going to do between you. So this is where we found ourselves. So the methods we took, we were in, it was a, I would say it was a, I think ethnographic is one of those terms which can be used. It's on a bit of a continuum. You've got full-on ethnography, let's go and live with these people for however long. And then you've got kind of ethnographically informed, pretty much sociolinguistic interviews. So we were towards the ethnographic end, because we spent a lot of time in these two centers. We spent a lot of time initially just hanging around and becoming familiar with the context, letting the young people and the staff become familiar with us. And we didn't record anything for months in one of the centers and for quite a few weeks in the other, until we felt confident and they were happy to be recorded. So there's lots of observation, lots of note-taking, lots of field diaries. In actual fact, the final field diaries were a massive 413,000 words. I can't take credit for a lot of it. The vast majority of these words were Susan's, because, like I say, that is literally what she does. She was incredibly good at it. And just reading her descriptions of what was going on are just fantastic. And I was coming in as a really naive, not very good ethnographer, just, barely managing to make note of who was speaking to who and what was going on. And then Susan just had these fantastically rich descriptions of everything that was going on. And it was wonderful. So we had these field diaries. We had, then we restarted, like I say, we started recording eventually. And we recorded some regular classes where we just have voice recorders. So we had, for those of you technically interested, we use Zoom recorders. We had a couple of Zoom H2s and quite a few, 6 or 7 Zoom H1s. And we'd either have a voice recorder, somewhere in the class as the class was going on, or we'd, some of the classes were much more practical. They'd be making stuff or doing stuff or cooking. Sometimes we just have little one-to-one chats with individuals or groups of people, and we record them. Sometimes we went, most of the time actually, the recordings were outside the class itself, but maybe while they were playing pool or playing table tennis or listening to music or whatever they were doing. And then often we'd also just give them the voice recorders as well, and they'd go and record themselves. So the problem with this kind of approach in a very lively, very noisy learning center with, young people who have been excluded from school for various reasons. There are lots of issues. It's quite a difficult place to be in order to try to carry out research. So our biggest problem maybe was, general engagement with the project. They were all obviously fully on board. The ones, if they had the absolute choice, and we only carried on working with them if they were fully on board with full consent, whatever. But still within that, there's sometimes resistance. Sometimes a young person would be very happy to be involved one day and then not so happy the next. Or sometimes they'd sort of forget what we were doing or pretend to forget what we were doing and wouldn't want to be involved or whatever. But then the next day they couldn't talk to us enough. There were all sorts of things going on. Noise, huge. It was a noisy place. You've got these young people all the time. There's lots of shouting, there's table tennis, there's pool, there's music in the background, there's everything going on. Perfect for Susan as an ethnographer. Look at all this lovely action things happening. For me, who relies on measuring vowels in Pratt and with ideally no background noise, it was awful. So that was really difficult. Note taking. How do you take notes? How do you take notes without it looking suspicious? Which is a really key point. You've got to think about how it looks when you're there. These young people don't need another adult being around to look like they're checking up on them. So we had to really think about our roles within the centres, and we ended up somewhere in the level of sort of classroom assistant. We couldn't be seen as too much as teachers, as figures of authority, but also we couldn't be seen as young people. We obviously weren't young people. That wouldn't be right anyway. So we were somewhere in between. We were just observers and we'd help out and whatever. But if we wanted to take notes, we had to be quite careful. And the way we got around it was just being very, very open. So Susan, especially, if she was writing something, if they wanted to come and look what she was writing, they were more than happy. She'd show them what she was writing. Incomplete data. For me, this was a problem, not so much for Susan. Was this idea that I really wanted to have a particular amount of spoken data from each of the participants. I wanted to be able to balance everything, to have this many girls, this many boys, make sure I got enough from each person to have some kind of balanced data set. It's impossible, can't be done. Other problems we had, slightly more serious, were to do with our approaches, with our approaches to research, our approaches to sociolinguistics. We soon realized that the way we were approaching things like identity itself were very, very different, or even what constitutes data. For me, the data was the speech. That was the most important thing. But of course, for a proper ethnographer and interactional person, everything is data. Everything, everything about the room. Even the space is interesting. The lack of activity, everything is interesting. And for me, I was still fixated on getting good recordings. We also had slight issues with terminology. We were using terminology in different ways. The problem, we had different terminology that we didn't understand from each other, but the worst thing was when we were using the same terms but meaning slightly different things, and that caused a lot of confusion. So we had these ongoing problems, and of course we soon realized that when you have an approach to something, every approach to language research comes with its own set of assumptions and theories and beliefs. And it's very hard to sort of challenge them yourself. So how this kind of caused issues. There were stages. There were these stages of realization. There were these stages of the process. And the first bit, I think, so I'm talking about the process of having two people wanting to do the research in the same place, but with different theoretical underpinnings to how you approach the situation. And I think at first it was sort of denial, really. We just denied there was a problem. We could see that we were working in different ways, but we thought it'll be fine. You know, it'll work itself out in the end. Then there's a bit of resistance in that you start to see, you know, that your approaches aren't compatible. So you start to maybe dig your heels in a bit and think, well, you know, I know what I'm doing, and what I'm doing is right. It works. And so let's, you know, maybe we won't do what that person's doing. We'll do what I'm doing. There's a bit of that. Then as you learn more about what the other person's doing, there's a bit of, it becomes acceptance. You start to realize that you do have different approaches, but there's a lot to learn from the other person. And this happened to me a lot because, of course, I was already had my reservations about the traditional approach, traditional variationist approach. And so this was feeding into all those criticisms, you know, a more ethnographic approach and all of these things. And I could start to see the faults in my own way of working. So then you have a bit of a panic because, of course, once you start admitting that your own way of doing things is flawed in some ways, then you worry about all the stuff you've done before, so that you've realized that all of your whole, you know, my whole career, I hadn't been working that, but it's, you know, I haven't been working that long, but it's, you start to think that everything you've done before is based on this idea. And if you're now undermining that idea, then what does that mean about everything I've done? And, you know, will I ever be let back into N-Wave or UK LBC, or what's going to happen if I don't agree with what's going on? So there's the absolute kind of panic, you know, that your way of working just isn't right. And I'd sensed this a lot because I was more and more convinced by Susan's way of doing things. They made a lot of sense. So I'd almost moved, you know, if I was sort of started over here with my own beliefs and Susan was here, and I'd gradually, you know, resisted it, but I'd moved towards Susan's way of doing things as being the right way. But then you have this level of understanding where you look back at your own way of doing things with a new critical eye, and you start to see all the good things in it after all. So you start to move over to another way of doing things and look back and think, actually, there are some really good things within, in my case, traditional variationist sociolinguistics. So we shouldn't abandon all of those things. And so there's this understanding that this kind of process is good. This kind of forcing yourself to collaborate is a good thing to do. Okay. And of course, this way of thinking affected my approach to identity. So let's say coming from a more traditional way of thinking, I guess I was always thinking that things like region, social class, gender, ethnicity, age, social network, all of these things are reflected some way in our language. Our language reflects our identity. That seemed to be the normal way of thinking about things. But of course, once you start to question this, and once you start to take a more interactional approach and looking at social practices much more than, you know, just the language by itself, you start to, of course, see the idea that our identities are enacted and performed through language. And this is, you know, 100% how I see identity now. And it was through this process that kind of made me do that. So in terms of the I'll sort of move on to a few sort of findings of what actually happened with this process. I can see time is getting on, and I said it was going to be, I did say at the beginning of this talk, is mostly going to be about the process itself, but I am going to give some results as well. So coming from this approach where it was difficult to group the young people in any way, partly because there was so few of them, but in the confined space, and also partly because that went against this, for me, new way of doing things. So, you know, why was I so obsessed with labeling people or putting into maybe ethnicity groups, you know, and because that would be a standard thing to do in most variationist studies. You sort of, think, okay, we've got this many this ethnicity, these people are this ethnicity, and we'd look for patterns. And Susan's argument, quite rightly, would be, well, if these people aren't enacting ethnicity, if it in this space at this time, then why is it possibly relevant? And I could, I began to see that more and more clearly. So rather than identify people within certain groups, we started to look at different orientations towards different social practices or towards particular attitudes, for example. And so I came up with this sort of scale. I had to say I now. The reason I'm saying I is not to necessarily take credit, but from now on, we're talking about the analysis I undertook on the project. And this, like I say, not to take credit, it's to let Susan off the hook in some way, because as I'll kind of explain more clearly at the end, the analysis had to take different avenues at some stage, because it turns out the two approaches are not necessarily compatible after all. So I came up with this scale of a sort of orientational scale where to do with particular ways of, types of music, ways of dressing, behaving, and so on. And so one way of thinking about it is that think of a typical person at each end of the scale. So a typical type A person, so a typical A end of the scale person would be someone who is into grime music, which is a sort of UK hip hop type music, but different, a lot more. It's a lot faster, it's a lot heavier. It's very, very British in its approach, in its topic, in the kind of content of the lyrics. But it is rap, so it has those similarities. So someone who is into grime, into dancehall, which is kind of Jamaican type music, maybe clothes-wise, or tracksuits, trainers, hoodies. Ethnicity, there's that variation. Still thinking about ethnicity. The actual typical type A might be of mixed heritage, kind of white British and black African, or white British and black Caribbean. Language-wise, they'd be using multicultural British English type features, and quite often they'd be male rather than female. I can see this circularity in the argument by saying we're talking about language, and there I am describing a person as using a particular type of language. But of course, I'm not using these scales to explain the language. I'm just trying to show which types of language pattern alongside which social practices. At the other end of the scale would be somebody who is not so much into grime and dancehall, but more into house music and R&B, who might be, more likely to wear sort of skinny jeans and trainers and t-shirts rather than hoodies and tracksuits. Ethnicity-wise, much more likely to be white, working class, probably Irish heritage, and have a typical, much more stereotypical local Manchester accent. And often it will be the girls who are in this group. But I see it as a real scale. I don't see it as a type A and type B. There were some people who were clearly A, some people who were clearly B, but a lot kind of in the middle, or would orient different ways with different ones of these features. They might be into a type of certain music, but might dress a bit differently or whatever. But this is a general way of, I don't like to think of kind of categorizing them, but certainly grouping them in some way towards social practice and attitudes. Okay, so just some of the, so let's say I'll give you a couple of results quite fairly quickly, so we can hopefully maybe have some questions. This is a val chart of the 11 speakers. So there are about, I guess we had about 24, 25 people overall, young people, because it was a fluid, it wasn't a fixed cohort throughout the study, but maybe we had 24, 25 people taking part. Couldn't get the type of recordings that would allow this type of acoustic analysis from everyone. As I've said, the process of data collection was quite challenging. So this is from 11 speakers. This is 934 tokens. So an average of around just over 4 tokens per val per speaker, which isn't a lot, I know, but it's something. It starts giving us an idea. And this is pretty standard for Manchester accent, a Northern English accent. You can see you've got strut and foot are pretty much overlapping. Same with Bath and trap. So there's, certainly a northern, as opposed, a Northern English accent as opposed to Southern English accent. Goose is very front, which is an interesting thing. There's obviously lots of goose fronting going on in a lot of varieties of English, but it's seen as certainly a feature of MLE, Multicultural London English, is a very an extreme kind of fronted goose. Diphthongs are still there. They're still, going strong. Face is a bit short trajectory, slightly typical of Northern English features anyway. But what's interesting about this is I'm going to look at two vowels, happy and letter. So I've got some examples here. So I've mentioned strut and Bath. So strut, the Northern variety, Bath, Northern variety. So I would say these are kind of supra-local Northern English varieties. Then you have these what I've called hyperlocal vowels, letter and happy, because there's a very distinct Manchester version of these. So there's a Northern version of all of these vowels, but there's a Manchester version of letter, which is very backed and very open and can be as far as kind of letter, Manchester. And then there's the happy vowel, which is very lax, and it can be kind of happy. Okay, so we get happy in lots of northern areas, but happy in Manchester. Now, that's not showing hugely on this chart. It's not that clear, but if we then split the speakers a little bit, start to see a distinct pattern. And these are so in red, we've got the A speakers. These are the ones that orient towards I said about grime music, hoodies, tracksuits, maybe mixed heritage, multicultural British English. They have a much less local happy, a much more generally Northern or even London to an extent, because it was quite tense happy, compared to some of the speakers at the other end. So in order to create this chart, I used 3 or 4 speakers who were much closer to the A end of the continuum of the scale, and 3 or 4 speakers who were much closer to the B end of the scale, and split those happy and letter vowels. And so for the B speakers, that's a real typical Manchester happy, very, where it's positioned there. And the same for letter. So the A speakers, the more maybe multicultural British English, grime oriented speakers were much more closer to a pretty sort of, I don't like the word standard, but a pretty sort of mainstream schwa for letter. And the B speakers, the more those ones who may be oriented to a more local, more traditional Manchester, white, working class, orientation, attitude, social practices, had a very stereotypical letter. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that these vowels, they don't play a part in MLE, Multicultural London English, or Multicultural British English. They don't play a part in themselves. But what I'm suggesting is that maybe the lack of the move away from the very local variant is perhaps some kind of a feature of what could be seen as multicultural British English. So maybe a rejection of the very, very local variants. So remember, I'm trying to come up with this idea of multicultural British English as being MLE type language, but being used in different regions. So it might be that you could make a case for multicultural British English being characterized by the existence of MLE phonetic features, which I haven't gone into here, but there are some MLE phonetic features in these young people's speech, alongside regional features, supralocal regional features, such as the strut vowel, the local strut vowel, and the local Bath vowel, but a rejection of markedly particular, specifically local features. We don't know, and this is a tentative interpretation of this. Loads more work needs to be done on multicultural British English if it's going to be seen as a thing. But this is perhaps somewhere to start. So I'd be interested to find, if anyone is watching this, that's where the research needs to be done. In other cities in the UK, when we're looking at possible multicultural British English MBE speakers, are they using MLE features, supralocal features, but rejecting particular hyperlocal features? Maybe there's something in that. We'll have to see. Okay, one other sound feature before I quickly talk about something else is TH stopping. So TH stopping is we're looking at voiceless TH stopping here. So it's not a very common feature of British English at all. It's in it where it does exist. It tends to have come from varieties of English which originated elsewhere. So West Indian Englishes and Creoles, Jamaican Creole, British Creole, Irish English. Although Irish English is slightly different. It's a very kind of dental TH stop. But there was some TH stopping going on here. There is a link between TH stopping and grime music and hip hop music, and there is something to explore there, which of course in turn has a particular association with ethnicity, even though ethnicity wasn't something I was particularly looking at here. Anyway, this chart just shows the extent of kind of voiceless TH, what's going on with voiceless TH. This is from 819 tokens, 25 speakers. Notice in the green is TH fronting, is f for th. So, TH fronting is by far the most common variant. 85% pretty much of all of the voiceless THs were actually F. 4 of the speakers here have it as categorically, that's all of their THs were pronounced as F. But there are some who use a stopped TH, so ting, tink, and ute. There are a few, but even those few don't use it very often. So with this part of the analysis, I did, go through a kind of full-on statistical analysis, and I've just given you the article here because I didn't want this to be a presentation where I'm just giving you slides and slides of numbers, but all those tables and tables of numbers and charts are in that article, which is open access, so anybody can go and see that. But through all the statistical modeling, what came out was that ethnicity, which might be something that you'd think would be relevant given the varieties of English in which TH stopping is common, given the ethnicity of some of the young people who were using it, there was that was worth exploring. It didn't come out as statistically significant at all, but through looking at some of the social practice categories, so the models were looking at things like ethnicity, gender, the formality of the context, taste in music, because thinking about the grime and hip hop connection, looking at interactants, who the people were speaking to, looking at the phonetic context, of course, and the word position. But what came up as most interestingly significant most of the time were the social practices to do with rapping, not necessarily to do with taste in music, but we'd often see the young people rapping, either in conversation or just in break time, whatever, just talking to each other. But like I say, often in conversation, literally within one conversation, they'd be talking in one way, and then they'd slip into rapping, in a very sort of grime-oriented way. So when we started looking at that as a factor, that became statistically significant. So that then involved some further sort of interactional analysis, which, again, thinking what I'd learned from everything I'd learned from Susan. So I was trying to do my own combining of two methods of a very sort of statistical, traditional approach to the numbers, to the tokens, and then looking at actually what was happening within interaction. And again, the example, I'm not putting the example here, but the example is in that article, but I try and illustrate how within one conversation, that feature, that TH stopping, is used to index some kind of stance of toughness. And it's a conversation with 4 or 5 young men who are talking about, it's a conversation in an art lesson, and they're talking about a friend of theirs who has been in prison and he's going to come out of prison. And through the whole conversation, the THs are almost all fronted, free thing, because that's, like I say, pretty much the standard. But then when the conversation changes into this topic, when they start talking about this guy who's coming out of prison, when they're all trying to align themselves with that particular lifestyle, when they're trying to outdo each other almost in who knows him best, there's a bit of kind of rivalry as to who's hanging out with him, who was chilling with him before so and so, and who knows him best. As that happens, the th stopping starts to come in, and I would say that it's being used in this way in order to index some kind of stance of toughness, of coolness. How it gets that link, how that indexical link is made, I would argue, is through grime music, which itself is very tough, very real, very gritty, and there's a whole load of identity performance going on within grime. And I would argue that feature, that variant of the stopped th, is associated with MLE, which is associated with grime. MLE is the language of grime, which is associated with a stance of toughness, of masculinity, if you like, of that, a particular type of masculinity. And then that link is made, and that's what they were using. So anyway, that was my interpretation, and people are free to have a look and agree or disagree. Okay, just a couple more things before I finish. Something quite nice, because everybody likes lexis, everybody likes new words, and there were the young people using some great words, and I'm a little bit obsessed with this sort of lexical variation of, or the language or new lexis within young people's speech, because it's so innovative and so fast moving, but also quite circular, because these were some of the terms that were very popular in the research, in the centers when we were doing the research. And of course, a lot of these were very popular 20, 30 years ago, but they've come kind of full cycle, and a lot of them are from kind of Jamaican origins. So these are some of them that were, very popular at the time. Allow it, meaning kind of leave it, let it alone, let it go, just allow it, man. Bait as an adjective, being obvious or acting suspiciously, don't be bait. Bear, very common, but a lot of, or very, bear people. Dead, meaning just sort of boring or rubbish or bad, or, this is dead, this work is dead, or this lesson's dead. You could also have semi-dead, which is quite good. These, what's it like? Semi-dead. Live, the opposite of that, something kind of good and maybe even exciting. Long was good. Something it was to do with things being boring, but they would require effort. So, maybe a teacher would ask them to do something. Oh, this is long, but it wouldn't be. It's not just boring. It's that effort element. Oh, this is really long. So that was good. And then, of course, man as a pronoun, replacing I or he. Lots of work within MLE. Jenny Cheshire especially has done a lot on this. Man's doing this, or man's got a question, or, what's man doing? So just simply to replace I or he. So that's all very well, and that's all, it was exciting and interesting at the time. But of course, as I've just said, the lexis moves on very, very quickly. And I was recently giving a talk, it was last year, I was giving a talk on a similar subject, and I realized that, and I was speaking to you, I was giving a talk to young people, and I realized that all of my examples were going to be already now dated. This was in 2014, 15. So already we're going to be dated. So I asked, just on Twitter, I just asked people for examples of any words that young people, if you're a young person, I asked for words that you use which older people don't understand. Or if you're an older person, I was asking for words that you hear young people use and don't understand. And these were some of the examples I got. I'm not going to go through them because, to be honest, I've forgotten what some of them mean. But the point is, this was my perfect example of how older people who criticize the way young people use language, you can't have it both ways. You can't, on the one hand, say, the way they speak is the way they use language is language is deteriorating. They only communicate in grunts. They know they don't know how to have a conversation anymore. They're so unsophisticated. You can't at the same time say that, but then also look at this list of words and think, I don't know what they mean. Because the fact is, this language is just as sophisticated as any other variety of language. It's just different, which anyone working in sociolinguistics or linguistics probably knows. But of course, a lot of people out there don't kind of make that connection. So definitely the last thing, and this is to just something I'm particularly proud of, and it's the something that came out of the research. So we spent a lot of time in there. We wrote up the research in the traditional ways, and I wrote a book about it, and we wrote some articles about it, whatever, and discussed our findings, and we discussed the process, as I've tried to do today. But there was one thing that came out of it which only could have come from seeing the data from two different perspectives. And this is an example of finding an opportunity that wouldn't have been there naturally, that I wouldn't have come across. And we've created a resource to be used as a teacher training tool, or as a communication tool to be used with the young people who are being educated in the pupil referral unit in the future. So we realized with our way of doing things, which I wouldn't have had if I'd gone in with my usual kind of sociolinguistic ways, in which I'd probably just have tried to organize some interviews and whatever, by being there all the time, by having the voice recorders on as much as we could, we captured loads and loads of spontaneous bits of communication or miscommunication, or loads of examples of interactions, some of which went well, some of which went wrong. And we had all of these things recorded and transcribed. And we thought it might be useful to highlight some of them as a maybe script to be used with the young people, in the future, to say, well, look at this, when something's happened, one of the staff could take a young person aside and say, well, look, this is what happened. This is a similar thing that happened to you. And look at how they got out of it, or look at how they reacted. How would you react? And, can you see this from somebody else's point of view, and so on. So we had these scripts made up, and then they were still a bit dry. So then I had this idea of getting them illustrated. And this is what we have here. And these are just some examples. There's 5 scenarios, each illustrated in this kind of style. And I know you can't see the detail, but it's basically, this is a thing that happened in the center, in one of the centers while we were there. And it's basically this particular story is about somebody locking somebody in that cupboard, in that cage type cupboard, and then denying, them being accused of it, and then saying it wasn't me, it was nothing to do with me, and so on. Then we have all these questions that are there to be used with the young people, saying, have you, in this particular one, have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? How did it feel? Look at the guy in the red tracksuit. How do you think he's feeling? What do you think he could have done differently? What do you think would have happened if he'd said this? Or to use with staff, it's kind of looking at the situation. Do you think the staff member was right in approaching it in this way? How could he have approached it differently? On different pages of the resource, we have different bits of text blanked out. So on the next version, there'll be just the adults speaking. All of the young person's speech will be blanked out, and then the young person can think, okay, what do you think is happening here? Why do you think he's angry? What do you think he's saying? And so on. At the moment, it's being trialed. It's being trialed in the centres that I was working in, and a few others, and it seems to be going well. With the current situation has made reflecting on that and gathering feedback a little bit difficult, but it seems to be going well. But I think the reason I wanted to share it was it's just a lovely example of giving back to the community we're working in, which we should always do, and also demonstrating something that came out of a collaboration that wouldn't have happened if that collaboration had not been there in the first place. Okay, so there we go. This is the final thing I'm going to mention, the final slide, just to sum up and on the realities of this kind of collaboration. Did our collaboration work? No, it didn't. Let's be honest, it didn't work. We went in thinking, let's have this collaborative project between a variationist and an ethnographer, interactional person, and approaching it, and it didn't. We've ended up, it's been very successful in very different ways, but a lot of the time we ended up having to do two separate analyses of what we were finding. Was it difficult? It was very, very difficult, right from day one. Was it worth it? Absolutely, yes. It was. I would not have done it any other way. Can't speak for Susan. We, throughout this, we got on incredibly well. That's one thing I haven't mentioned. I've sort of mentioned Susan's name a few times. As research partners, we got on really, personally, we got on really well, and it was great to work with her, and I hope she feels the same. But in terms of approaches, it was always problematic, but it was worth every single moment. Has it made me a better researcher? 100% yes, because it's made me reflect on what I was doing before, and being forced to reflect has made me, I think, a much better researcher. But I recommend it without question. And does variationist work need it? Definitely. But to be fair, you can put anything in there. Collaboration is a good thing. It's the only way, I think, in which you are forced to critically reflect on how you approach things. You can, like I said at the beginning, you can compromise with yourself all the time. You can say, oh, okay, I should be doing that. That is a problem, but we can ignore it. Let's just ignore that for now. But if somebody is there forcing you to engage with and interrogate what you're doing, then you have to think about it. And I think that was all I wanted to say. These are the details of the projects I'm working on. So there's the Urban ID project. This is what I've been talking about, the youth language. That was with Susan Dray, because none of this was done by myself. Manchester Voices, as I said, is some project I co-run with my colleague, Dr. Erin Carey from Manchester Met, and we have two fantastic research associates, Dr. Sadie Ryan, Dr. Holly Dan, and the Accentism project is one I work on with, who also co-run with Dr. Erin Carey. Those are the links to, those are the web addresses of all the various bits and pieces, and that finally is just a list of the outputs from this particular research. So that's the book, which describes, this is what this talk has been based on, really, is that that book describes the process, all the highs and the lows and the challenges of carrying out this kind of research. And there are some other articles and whatever there. And that, I think, is everything. And that's all I want to say.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Rob. Your talk was very interesting. So people were posting some questions on the chat on YouTube, and I've selected some of the questions. So the first one actually comes from Delangis Dalir, and she asked, can we suppose youth language as a parametric cognitive variation of language capacity in sociolinguistics, that our brain be ready for this variation in mind in advance?
Sorry, say again. So we're looking at whether the brain, sorry, can you repeat the first bit? This sounds like it's too clever for me.
Yes, yeah, it's can we suppose youth language as a parametric cognitive variation of language capacity in sociolinguistics, that our brain be ready for this variation in mind in advance?
God, that's way too clever for me. I don't know. I think, well, no, because I think we're labeling youth language, we're labeling a type of language as youth language or the language of young people. But of course, language, that's an artificial label. The whole idea of youth is an artificiality in some way. It's just a label we've put on a particular period of life, which of course, traditionally, as we know, looking through history, didn't necessarily exist in the same way anyway in the past. So I would have thought, no, it's just part of our kind of cognitive ability to cope with language variation anyway. It just happens to be, I happen to be looking at it focusing on that particular variation, but there's lots of other everything that's every way in which language varies, I guess, gives us an insight into how language is, stored or approached cognitively. But there you go. That was a very vague answer because I really don't know.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Daniel McAuley, and he said, "Can you come back to questioning the urban in MUPE? I understand the problems with connotation and diffusion beyond cities, but can we assume that it originated in urban areas?"
This has been a real kind of recent problem for me, and I don't know quite what to do. And I actually asked, I put it sort of out there on Twitter as well at the time, because I've never particularly liked the label that I came up with, the multicultural urban British English, only because it didn't quite, it was actually quite hard to, the acronym was a bit weird as well, and it didn't quite sound right, but it seemed to describe what I was doing. It was multicultural, and it was in a city, and it was British English. For a while, I started actually backing away from the multicultural part of the label and started calling it urban British English. And then, I don't know, then that seemed slightly problematic, because then it does have this particular connotation, and it has an ethnicity angle, which I wanted to move away from. So there was a possibility, as one of my friends pointed out, I might have, by dropping the multicultural, I was arguably making it worse. I was doing the opposite of what I was trying to do, because I was trying to drop the multicultural by taking the emphasis away from ethnicity, because that's really the point, that our urban centers are multicultural, they are multi-ethnic, there's lots of languages. So why do we need another label, that makes it something different, that almost others these things? And I didn't want that. I wanted to be more inclusive, but there was a possibility I was going the wrong way about it. So then I behind the scenes, I contacted some friends and colleagues who work with multicultural London English, and we had a bit of a discussion on email about, and luckily for me, I was reassured to find that everybody finds labeling language varieties problematic, because there's always something else to consider. There's always a connotation you're not quite aware of. And of course, everybody sees labels in different ways. So between us, we kind of said, yeah, if you're going to go down this route, I think multicultural British English is probably the way to go. But I realized that every time I use it, I'm going to have to, explain the label a little bit. But that's fine. We know as linguists, we know the power of language. We know the power of labeling things anyway. So it's our responsibility to be quite careful. But that was the thinking behind dropping the urban, to be honest. And I think it's the right thing to do, as I said, not just because of those connotations, but also because the evidence seems to be more and more people are using this way of speaking outside urban areas anyway. So it becomes a needless part of the label, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So Daniel also said you could lose the British as well if you're interested in the UK, but we need labels. And then he said also same problem with multi-ethnolect. Yeah.
Yeah, true. I absolutely, totally agree. Multi-ethnolect, I have a problem with anyway. And again, I was trying to distance. I don't like that term, that label at all. And yeah, you're absolutely right. British. Yeah, see, this is it. So what can we call it? So we end up being, it becomes so difficult to label things. So I think I'm going to stick with it. I can't keep changing it. Otherwise people will, won't refer to it, and I want this to be the beginning of an ongoing, series of research project, not just for me, but I want other people to sort of run with it and start looking in other urban centers as well. And so it'd be useful if we're using a similar kind of label just to bring things, to try and bring things together, to try and get a complete picture. But it is really difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. So now Andrea Menegotto from Argentina, she asked, if you had the chance to go back in time and do it all over again, would you change anything in the data gathering methodology to make the collaborative work better?
That's a really good question. Do you know what? I honestly don't think I would. I think the collaboration now would work much more smoothly because just because I've learned so much from doing it, and in the first place, so I can see I've kind of come to terms with the weaknesses of my own approach previously, but also I can see the weaknesses of where I was moving towards, and as I said, looking back and seeing all the strengths as well of where I was in the first place. So that's a really good question. I don't think I'd do it differently. I think I'd do it in exactly the same way, and I certainly would want to do it with Susan Dray, who was just fantastic. So no, I'd do it again, even though it was really difficult.
Yeah, okay. I have some question myself for you. So the first one is like the scale that you showed was designed based on your field observations?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I still feel a little bit uneasy with the scale. It's actually, yeah, I feel uneasy with the idea of sort of labeling people and categorizing people in this way. And also, again, what to call it, because when I was writing it in my book, I call it this kind of urban sort of street scale or something, which again had the wrong, at the time I didn't mean anything, but it had the wrong sort of connotations, or it has questionable connotations. So I backed away from that. But there is definitely some sort of, I think that's a useful way to see people in a sense, as not necessarily one thing or another, but as orienting towards things. So some stuff I didn't show you today was, looking at, for example, different vowels and the extent to which this happy and the letter vowel, for example, letter, the extent to which that was backed and open in a traditional way. And we can have, I've got these nice sort of box plots organized along the order of where I felt these people positioned on the scale. And, you can see a clear pattern. Mm-hmm. And again, that's open to the criticism of it being a circular kind of description. You're using language to put these people on a scale in some ways, and then you're looking at how they use language. But it was never about explaining the variation. It was always about just exploring the way in which language variation behaves alongside all of these other kind of semiotic resources of dress, behavior, attitudes towards different things. So yeah, it came from, again, that couldn't have happened I couldn't have done that in the traditional way I was doing things before, because that wouldn't have been possible without that was after months and months of observing and seeing what was going on.
Okay. So now Professor Olivia Washiro has a question for you. So she said, this is a very interesting discussion about labels, which are always problematic. Would it be possible that at all to do variationist linguistics without labels, or is it a consequence of the statistical analysis?
That's a good question. I think it's pretty impossible. I think impossible to do it without. And I hope I've been kind of clear throughout this that when I was talking about having the problem with the collaboration with the different disciplines and moving and having my problems with traditional variationist sociolinguistics, but then it was very important, that point of looking back and seeing all the good things, because there are so many good things about traditional variationist sociolinguistics, and this idea of it going in waves of so-called the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, just because we're in the kind of third wave or post third wave doesn't mean that the first wave and second wave is gone. It's just they're different. They're not replacing each other. It's just adapting. And there's plenty of really good work still going on in first and second wave. I think there are slight problems with some of the macro labels, as everyone knows, but the idea of using those statistical models is still a real strength, and I'm still very much part of that way of doing things. And in that way of doing things, yeah, I think you're right. I don't think there is a way to get rid of labels, because we have to quantify stuff in order for that to work. And it would be wrong to quantify data unnecessarily just to fit a way of doing things. But if that way of doing things can tell us things, which it can provide insights, which it does, then it's worth doing. But in order to do it, we have to quantify things. In order to quantify things, we have to give them labels. So yeah, I think we can learn as you know, this is nothing new, but we can just learn to be better with our labeling. And obviously, you know, it's a long time, surely. So we're moving away from such kind of, certainly from, you know, things like binary categories of sex and all sorts of things. We're being a lot better with our labeling, but there's still, I guess, work to be done.
And I think the way you did is very interesting too, of like you creating your categories based on the field observation. I think
Yeah, I think that's a
step forward. Yeah.
Yes, if I've learned anything, it's that there should be some ethnographic element in anything we do. I think because we can't forget the context in which that language emerged. So, and if that ethnography can help with the labeling as well, then even better.
So I think I don't see any other questions. I will have one final question myself. So it's just like about second language acquisition. So all the speakers, they were all native speakers of different dialects of English, or there were second language speakers of English. And did you take it like into consideration?
We do, all natives, all native.
Okay.
In that sense. Yeah. So I think there were one or two had maybe a different heritage language, a different language at home, possibly. But no, they were all, in those terms, they would all be classed as native English speakers.
Okay, great. So I think that's it. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor. It was a very interesting talk. And again, I ask everyone to please support Abralin in our event, Abralin ao vivo. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, bye.